Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. It's Thursday, May 1st. It's a busy end of March, all of April for IU basketball. To help us discuss the month that was, Zach Osterman of the Indy Star, good friend of the show, good friend of mine, back on Podcast on the Brink this week. Before we get to Zach, wanted to take a moment to let you know that this episode of Podcast on the Brink is brought to you by Visit Bloomington, as always. Really appreciate our friends at Visit Bloomington. Just because the basketball season is over doesn't mean the fun stops. Spring is the perfect time to explore everything Bloomington has to offer. Hike the trails at Griffey Lake Nature Preserve, then refuel with local flavors on tap at Upland Brewing Company. Don't forget about the many music festivals coming to Bloomington this spring. Whether you're into outdoor adventures, food, or just relaxing in a vibrant college town, Visit Bloomington's got you covered. Start planning your spring getaway now at visitbloomington.com. Zach is battling a sinus infection, but he has been gracious enough to join us on this episode of Podcast on the Brink. First of all, Zach, non-IU related, wanted to take a moment to congratulate you on the Jim O'Connell Award that you received last month at the USBWA luncheon down at the Final Four. I know that was something maybe that you're not going to talk about too much publicly on your own podcast, but did want to take a moment here on Podcast on the Brink as someone who has known you for a long time. At one point you carried a potted plant in your front seat of your car, wrote about that for Inside the Hall. So you've come a long way, and I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate you on that. Well deserved. I know a lot of IU fans feel very lucky to have you covering the team. So just wanted to say that before we started this week's episode.
Well, thank you, friend. I really appreciate that. It meant a lot. I'm still confident there are people that were more deserving than I was, but you and I have both been hammering away at this a long time. I think you were a member of the USBWA before I was. I'm pretty sure you showed me how to sign up. So, we go back to many a Moses Abraham recruiting update. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
And the Guy Marc Michel contract. Remember that? That was always
the investigation. One of the most in-depth investigations I've ever been a part of.
So I haven't had you on the show since the hiring of Darren DeVries. You've obviously had a chance to sit down with him, talk with him a little bit. You've covered the portal, everything that's gone on. You're at the Final Four, kind of a whirlwind. 6 weeks for you here? Just what was your reaction to kind of where Indiana landed in this coaching search and what we've seen so far, just in terms of the roster that they've assembled, the coaching staff? It seems like things are really starting to come into place, and you can see a clear plan in place in Bloomington for this first roster for DeVries.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the coach, a lot of, I know I don't speak for the people. I know I was focused for a long time on Ben McCollum. Frankly, I think I'm not saying DeVries will be a better coach than McCollum long term. DeVries certainly has a better resume. I think in my own sort of evaluation of like the field, as it were, DeVries felt like the kind of person that you push to one side because he'd just taken the West Virginia job. At that time he was doing fairly well in it. I think, we were all, broadly speaking, surprised West Virginia didn't make the NCAA tournament. You think, if you want to maybe a comparison point, you think about Dusty May, and there were a lot of people who said, Dusty May wouldn't leave Michigan after 1 year because coaches don't do that very often. And that the only real sort of justification for believing it might happen was his background with Indiana. And of course, the fact that he was an IU alum. So, I didn't necessarily like push a pin into Darren DeVries as the absolute home run hire. I just kind of looked at him and thought coaches don't leave jobs after a year very often. Now, there are a variety of reasons why it makes sense when you just sort of sit and think about it, sort of in a cold and analytical way why he would do that. But I think that, certainly from the point he was hired and the number of different people I've talked to or observed or listened to, West Virginia people upset about losing him, people that I know in the sport who have, very little affection for Indiana basketball, who think it's a pretty good hire. I think, at least early on, my reaction was, I think probably something akin to, okay, let's see how this works. Let's see what this looks like. And to your point, I think thus far, while I've seen too many of these sort of portal roster remakes make sense on paper and then not come together in practice. There's a lot in theory to like about what kind of the trajectory Indiana is on for next season, based on the players that Indiana's been able to bring in, based on, I think, some, in different cases, some fairly obvious fits to what DeVries teams have kind of done historically. I don't think Indiana's going to be the perfect team by any means, but it's not hard to sell me on the idea that it's going to be a better team, than it's been the last couple of years. And I think you've certainly seen Indiana flex its financial muscle in the roster building process. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think anyone should apologize for that. That is just, part of the equation for success in college basketball, in 2025. But I think there's also been, quietly, I think there have been a number of different sort of data points or mile markers in this process that have been encouraging. I mean, when was the last time you saw Indiana hire an assistant coach off an Elite Eight team? That we've seen Indiana try, but we've not seen Indiana do it. And that alone doesn't mean this is all going to work. But it's things like that. And it's if you just sort of, if you sit down and you array out everything that we've seen over the last, probably 6 weeks since DeVries was officially confirmed, there is a lot, I think, to be encouraged by, whether it's DeVries' own background, the players he's recruited, the extent to which it feels like you can track, kind of this roster process, and you can see, I mean, not to buy into a Twitter line, but you can see the vision a little bit. I just think there's, I'm too old and I've seen too many false dawns to sit here and promise anybody that, this is a home run and it's all going to work out. But I think there are reasons for encouragement as we sit here today on May 1.
Yeah, it's been interesting just to try to compare this situation to the last two coaching hires, because, as you said, I feel like when Archie Miller was hired, there was a ton of optimism for many reasons, coming off of his tenure there at Dayton, and it felt like he assembled a really strong coaching staff. It was also a much different time in college basketball without the transfer portal. And then Woodson obviously came in and kept Trace Jackson Davis around, which was a huge recruiting win. I think it really helped propel him for his first two seasons and what he was able to do there, getting to the tournament. And you mentioned sometimes we fall into that trap of, judging a hire. I think, quite frankly, people have asked me, like, what do you think of this hire? I'm like, I can't really tell you right now, because, anything I say would be a complete guess. I think all of us are guessing. We can do things for clicks and say this is an A hire, this is a B+ hire. But kind of, looking at this and maybe comparing it to what Indiana did the past two hires, is there anything you can point to in terms of the process to where they arrived here? It feels like it was a little bit more, maybe more data driven in terms of the work that they did in the background and kind of the profile that they were looking at. Is there anything maybe that stands out different from this search and where they arrived compared to the last two?
I think I think there were some data driven elements. I mean, I thought, the Mike Woodson hire, for a lot of reasons, was kind of a piece unto itself. And, I know there's a lot of people that want to get into kind of the palace intrigue of, who was flexing their muscle in that, and trustees and whatever. I'd also point out, like, Indiana was hiring somebody in the middle of a pandemic, and we were about to enter an NIL world we had no idea about. I mean, like, I remember in those first days of NIL, people getting really excited about partnerships with like banks and, like restaurants, I mean, the idea that you look back now and that all seems so quaint, but we had no idea what any of that looked like. And we were living in a very uncertain world then. And so the Woodson hiring almost is kind of a piece unto itself. But I think that Indiana, certainly was trying to use a mixture of sort of data and research. And when I say research, I mean both numbers research and calling people that various sort of, stakeholders trusted to quiz them on, what do you think of this coach, or do you think that could work, or whatever. It was a combination of both of those things. I think in particular, like, this was not necessarily the thing that convinced me, oh, this process was ideal and this will absolutely work. But I think, for example, Indiana took some steps to try and ensure that it wasn't hiring. I don't want to call Archie Miller fool's gold. I think that's unfair. Like, he went to 4 straight tournaments. That's not an easy thing to do. But one of the data points that Indiana kind of came to with Darren DeVries that I think it was looking for in saying, is there something that we're missing? Is there something that we missed in hiring Archie Miller that can inform whether or not the next guy is the right guy? And one of the things that they found was that basically that Archie Miller had success at Dayton, but that there was an extent to which that success had been carried over from Brian Gregory. And I think actually Gregory he hadn't gone to the tournament, I don't think, but he'd won more games in his last 4 years in Dayton before taking the Georgia Tech job than Archie Miller won in his first 4 years in Dayton. It was still a healthy number both ways. It was like 95-90. But the point was, there was already a structure in place at Dayton that Archie Miller was able to inherit and refashion and, kind of remake in some aspects according to his own designs, and then carry that forward and have success with. Whereas Darren DeVries at Drake, the numbers were something like 40 and 96. That I think Drake had won 40 games the 4 years before he got there. The number was somewhere in the 90s. I don't remember, 94, 95, 96, somewhere in there. That was how many games he won in his first 4 years. And when you looked at, just in general, the 6-year run he had at Drake had really never, in the modern structure of, let's say, the modern NCAA tournament, Drake had never had a run like that. You have to go back to the late 60s, early 70s, back when, the NCAA tournament only let in like 12 teams or 16 teams, and the NIT was very competitive, and there were other postseason events and things. If we say the modern era of college basketball, that probably starts either at 32 teams in the NCAA tournament, or I think there was a brief period where there were 48 teams in the NCAA tournament. I think in 81, Indiana's second national title under Bob Knight, I think that was a 48-team tournament. That is probably kind of the quote-unquote modern era of college basketball. And Indiana's research showed that basically Drake had never been successful at anywhere near that level consistently in that span until Darren DeVries arrived. And there were other, I think, marker points too. And then I think there was probably some encouragement over what he did at West Virginia. He was only there for a year, but obviously, they win 19 games. Probably would have won more if his son hadn't gotten hurt. Again, we don't need to hash up what happened on Selection Sunday, but everyone sort of felt like if there was a team that really, got, kind of shafted in the selection process, it was almost certainly West Virginia. So I think there was a slightly more. Now, let me also say, I don't think Indiana didn't take an analytical approach in hiring Archie Miller. I do think Indiana tried to identify both marker points for what had made coaching hires successful at similar institutions in the recent past. And I think somewhat importantly, Indiana had also tried to identify why its own hires had not worked out. And I think that sort of self-reflection and that willingness to be a little bit self-critical, I think, should give fans at least a little bit more comfort around how and why Indiana landed on Darren DeVries. That this wasn't just a process of, let's go find the guy who nails the interview and has the best references and whatever. But let's ask the question of, what have we gotten wrong in the past that has gotten us onto this carousel of 3 or 4 years new coach, 3 or 4 years new coach, and how do we correct that in the way that we evaluate the candidates that we consider for this job?
Looking at just kind of the roster right now, 11 scholarship players. I think that's right. If you include Trent Sisley, 10 portal commitments, 11 with Sisley. The potential maybe for Luke Goody, depending on what happens with the waiver process. Just in big picture, this roster that they've put together for year one, what maybe stands out to you in terms of some of the just the way that the roster was built positionally? I know some people have asked me, well, is there going to be a rim protecting big man? I'm not sure that's going to be something that's added from this point forward. I'm not saying it's not going to be, but it seems like in some ways that they're somewhat comfortable with what they have right now in the front court. What just from a roster construction standpoint has stood out in terms of the pieces they put together, and also how competitive do you think this team can be in year one? Obviously, we've seen it in the last cycle with some big time programs hiring coaches, getting to the tournament right away. Some of the recruits that they've landed, I've talked to, and they've all referenced, the goal is get to the tournament, compete in the Big Ten in year one. It certainly seems like they've got the pieces to do that, albeit some guys they're betting on coming up from a lower level. So I'm just kind of curious for where you think this roster stands right now. Are there needs for other positions, and just in terms of competing next year, what do you think is realistic for this group?
Well, listen, it's obviously difficult. It's never been harder to evaluate like that question when so much turns over everywhere. Like, there should be, I think, a robust amount of belief in Dusty, again, going back to Dusty May at Michigan. But on the other hand, Dusty May lost some of his most important players. Like that whole team, in a lot of respects, was built around Danny Wolf, Vlad Golden, and Trey Donaldson. And they're all gone. Donaldson transferred. I'm not losing my mind, right?
Right now he's going to Miami.
But they brought in some really promising transfers. They've got one of the best, on paper, one of the best transfer classes in the country. So you look at it and you say, well, Dusty May has earned, sort of the trust, the right to be believed in until proven wrong, even if he's turning over the roster. But on the other hand, if we're sitting here and we're evaluating, the only two guys on that team that had a usage rate above 22% are gone. So is that team's starting point guard. So you kind of have to see it to know for sure. On paper, and I'm pulling up your scholarship chart just to remind myself, because it's so easy to forget with all of these new names. On paper, a lot of it makes sense. And especially when you think back to DeVries' sort of outline of his own team, when we talked to him the day he was hired, there was a lot of discussion of motion principles. I don't think he used the term positionless basketball, but that's kind of what motion offense is, right? Like, it's the idea that the ball keeps moving and you're not, like, to use the Mike Woodson offense, which, let's be fair to it, had some successful years, especially under Trace Jackson Davis, or with Trace Jackson Davis in the post. Once your transition options were exhausted, that offense was built around posting up a big, throwing in the ball, and then letting everything operate off of that a lot of the time, or choosing to bring that big out into a ball screen situation and then letting that operate out of that a lot of the time. The way that DeVries talks about his offense, and every, it's a lazy comparison, but every time I see it or every time I hear him talk about it, I think about Creighton is a little bit more motion-based, certainly a lot less post-up based. I think there's going to be plenty of ball screen action, but you can have ball screen action with motion concepts. And when you look at, of course, you got 3 players on this roster you would probably describe positionally as point guards, or at least as lead guards, in Connerway, Enright, and Drake. You've got multiple wings. Your bigs, we'll see what Josh Harris maybe becomes long-term, but functionally your bigs right now can fit a fairly specific sort of set of roles at both ends of the floor: protect the rim, rebound, screen, lob, finish well, etc. It's not hard to make a lot of this make sense sort of functionally under what DeVries has sort of said. These are my sort of philosophies, especially offensively. These are, the concepts that I kind of draw from. But I suspect this is where I'm going to sound really boring for the next few months until you see it work, especially with a completely new team. I mean, we'll see if Indiana gets Luke Goody back. We'll see. But it is going to be, at very least, damn near a completely new team until you see all of these pieces sort of arranged on the floor. And you can look at and say, this guy sets the tone defensively. These are the players that make sure Indiana's rebounding the ball at the level that it needs to. The shooting, the scoring has translated up from the mid-major level for a Lamar Wilkerson, for Tucker DeVries is a little bit of kind of a halfway house there, right? Because he was looking encouraging at, I'm losing my mind, at West Virginia, but that's a small sample size. But a Nick Doran, a Jason Drake, until you see it and and this is where I think Indiana going on a preseason tour is maybe one of the easiest decisions for DeVries in, kind of the first few weeks of his tenure. You're just not 100% sure. And the flip side to that is you can say that about, all manner of teams in the Big Ten. And I think back, some of the comparisons I found myself making going in both directions is, nobody really knew what to expect from Kentucky last year in Mark Pope's first season. Similar situation, maybe not quite the same amount of roster turnover, but a lot of players pulled in from somewhere else. Amari Williams was at Drexel. Otega Owe was at Oklahoma. I think Jackson Robinson was at BYU, I think, with Mark Pope.
Yeah.
And that wound up working really well. I mean, from kind of early on, that team, that Kentucky team beat Duke in November. It beat Gonzaga in December. It beat what turned out to be a pretty good Louisville team that same month and beat Florida, the eventual national champion, to start conference play. And, it ends up 10-8 in the SEC. But if right now I promised you, let's say 11-9 in the Big Ten and 24 wins in a Sweet 16 appearance next year, that would be a substantial, win for Indiana in Darren DeVries' first season. On the other hand, the other example I've used, and I understand that in the end they wound up in the Sweet 16, but we could have told a very similar story about Arkansas. And John Calipari, and I think a lot of people were getting a lot of mileage out of that clip of Calipari saying, "I've talked to the team. There is no team." And that team again similarly turned over. Of course, Cal brings some players with him from Kentucky, so it's a little bit of a different roster building process. But if anything, that should make everything go a little bit smoother. And yet, that team starts 1-6 in SEC play and spends the entire year swimming upstream before, to its credit, it gets into the tournament and makes a little bit of noise. I'm not predicting Indiana's going to wind up in the Sweet 16. I'm using those as two sort of sort of opposite examples of when you turn your roster over as much as Indiana has, there's just no way to know for sure. A lot of this makes sense to me on paper. A lot of this makes sense to me positionally, functionally. I even like kind of the pieces that Indiana's got that should have years beyond this year. So you can talk about a little bit of a pathway for someone like Nick Dorn or Josiah Miles to say, you're going to be this year, but you're also going to be this next year, something different next year. You just need to see it. And like I said, I probably am going to become a boring broken record in the next few months when I talk about this, but I just don't really know of any other way to talk about it except conceptually to suggest that, the proof will be in the pudding one way or the other.
Do you think, I've had some people ask me, readers of the site, various emails, things like that, just asking about the fact that Indiana has so many guys moving up from the mid-major level to the high major level, concerns about that. Do you think it matters all that much now in kind of the modern system that we're in terms of the portal and player movement? It seems like rather than trying to reach for maybe a guy that didn't produce as much at the high major level, it maybe make more sense to go and get a guy that was, the Sun Belt Player of the Year or an all freshman guy in a lower level league and bet on that production maybe translating. I'm just curious what you make of the fact that, you mentioned DeVries having kind of their trial run at in the Big 12, but he was two-time Missouri Valley Player of the Year. You look at some of these other guys, I do realize they did get a transfer from Florida, but most of them are kind of unproven at this level. And I'm curious if there should be any concern or how you think that translates with so many guys trying to move up.
No, I mean, listen, I had somebody suggest to me that Indiana was using a Cignetti-esque approach to building its roster. And I said, well, where do you think most of these transfers are going to come from? Curt Cignetti didn't invent the idea of going out and finding players with proven production and betting on the idea that enough of that production will translate up a level, for that player or that group of players to be successful. So, maybe this is obviously completely, hypothetical, but, maybe Lamar Wilkerson doesn't quite shoot or score at the level that he did at Sam Houston State, but maybe Nick Dorn, his numbers translate pretty cleanly from Elon. And then in the aggregate, you get a better roster kind of on the in the overall when you finally boil it all together. Go back and look at that Kentucky team. Owe comes from Oklahoma, but Williams comes from Drexel. Lamont Butler comes from Wake Forest.
San Diego State, I think. San Diego State.
San Diego State. Thank you. I think Andrew Carr came from Wake Forest. Go look at Auburn. Chad Baker-Mazara comes from San Diego State. I think people forget, because he was at Auburn for so long, but Janai Broome started his career at the mid-major level at Morehead State. It's not and the flip side is I can find you examples. Houston's two, I'm using Final Four teams here. Houston's two major sort of impact transfers. LJ Cryer came from Baylor. Milas Uzan came from Oklahoma. So, it can go both ways. And the flip side is I can take you back to last year when Indiana went out and recruited a whole bunch of, in a lot of cases, pretty statistically successful high major players. Caden Carlisle averaged 11.5 points roughly a game at Stanford as a freshman. Miles Rice was Pac-12 Freshman of the Year, first team all conference. Umar Ballo, had a resume as long as your arm of individual achievements and successes at Arizona. Luke Goody, and Goody is maybe the outlier in that transfer class in the sense that he winds up being exactly what Indiana needed from him, if not even maybe a little bit more, a little bit better, particularly offensively. But my point is, one way it's not that one way is right and one way is wrong. Increasingly, I have just come to believe that it is basically just a question of whether the coach is is capable of taking the players that he decides fit what he's trying to do and put them in the right positions to succeed. Again, there's always this temptation to use teams that were in the previous season's Final Four as the paradigm. But it is interesting to kind of go through those rosters and think about, like I said, Houston didn't take a ton of transfers. That's not Kelvin Sampson's way. The two high-profile transfers in his rotation both came from high major conferences. On the other hand, Florida and Auburn are two programs that had, I think Florida's two primary guards. Maybe, I mean, we can have this discussion, but maybe its two most important players, just in terms of raw production and ability, came from FAU and Iona. So, what my anecdotal experience tells me is, number one, it makes perfect sense because that is where the majority of your talent is going to be in the portal. If you're a team like Indiana, to look at players who are trying to up transfer. That's Luke Wynn's old phrase from when he was at Sports Illustrated, up transfer from a mid-major program to a high major program. There are going to be a lot more for a program like Indiana that's always looking for, players at the top end of the talent pool. There are going to be a lot more of those players than there are going to be productive high major players, because productive high major players, their teams will have tried their best to retain them. It makes all the sense in the world to target those players. This roster, yes, leans heavily into that, right? Again, let's go back to the scholarship question. Sam Alexis is from Florida, but go down the list from there. Davidson, Troy, West Virginia, 1 year at DePaul, but before that, Drake. The same can be said for Tucker DeVries, Sam Houston, Elon, Drexel, North Florida. Yes, this roster leans a little bit heavier into the mid-major sort of talent pool than most. But my experience, and like I said before, it is anecdotal, has taught me that really it just comes down to the coach. And if the coach has a firm, clear-eyed idea of what his team needs and his confidence in being able to identify it and then adapt it into the overall, sort of team, then you'll be fine. And if the coach doesn't have that, it doesn't really matter what you recruit. It doesn't matter if you recruit guys with McDonald's All-American pedigrees or guys that were all, first team all-conference at a high major conference a year ago or whatever. You'll struggle because the team just won't make sense. And again, there's a lot that I can look at in Darren DeVries' past and sort of overlay onto this roster and make it make sense. But you just kind of have to, seeing is going to be believing.
Yeah, I think what I've kind of told people is there's a finite number of those high major contributors anyway that are going to be willing to transfer, because a lot of them are, like you said, either getting paid handsomely by their current school, or some of them, the best ones, are going pro. You look at some of the price tags that we've seen assigned to some of these higher profile guys. $3 or $4 million for one player. I'm not sure how much that makes sense when you're trying to completely overhaul your roster to the extent that Indiana is. And I also think that it's smart to take guys that have proven it 1 year or 2 years somewhere else to have remaining eligibilities and reach for freshmen and a freshman or two in the spring. Not saying that a freshman or two couldn't be added, but I don't think those are guys you want to depend on necessarily next year when you're trying to get in the tournament year one. So I think they've kind of hit the sweet spot of, who knows, this could all be wrong. They could underperform, but I think they've done a solid job of identifying guys who've produced at their level. You look at all the 3-point percentages of the guards, the wings that they brought in. It's clearly they had a marker there, and we're not going to take guys that can't shoot from the perimeter. That's a welcome change, I think, for a lot of people. You look at some of the advanced statistics, offensive rebounding percentage, block percentage, some of the front court players they got. A lot of them, top 50, top 100 nationally in those categories. Those are strong indicators that they're going to be able to do the things that they need out of the front court. So, I like the approach. I think it's been a sound approach. I think there's been a clear plan. I think that's the one thing I keep coming back to. And this is nothing against Mike Woodson. This is nothing against how he built his teams. He certainly had a lot of talent, produced NBA players, but you didn't always feel like there was a rhyme or a reason to the pieces that they were putting together. It kind of felt like sometimes just collecting talent and trying to throw it all out there. We'll figure it out once the games start. This feels much more just organized in terms of who they're targeting and what they want to put together. And I think that gives you a chance to really have more success in the long term. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is kind of a thing we could probably have a whole show on, so I don't want you to take too long. I know you're battling a cough over there, but just the whole house settlement that's kind of lingering over college sports right now. What's the end game for all this? Is this something that's going to be resolved here in the next couple of weeks in terms of the roster limits from everything you've heard and read? What maybe are the next things we're looking for just in terms of this getting put into place and how that impacts things moving forward? Because I think a lot of us were operating on the idea of, well, we had this April 7th date. This was going to be a big marker, and now that's kind of all come and gone, and it seems like there's still some negotiations going on as to whether this actually gets done.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. Like the long form answer to that question is probably not just complicated, but above my pay grade. I think what does seem to be holding it up right now primarily is this question of roster caps. And I think, I tried to write an explainer on this last week that, sports scholarship limits as they existed before the house settlement remain the same. So football can have 85 scholarship players, men's and women's basketball are full counter sports at 13. You still have your equivalency sports and so forth. What the house settlement is going to allow is for schools to commit, if they choose, $2.5 million of the $20.5 million of their revenue sharing pool toward more scholarships. And per my understanding, and this is primarily by Kurt Signetti, is you can't do it a la carte. You can't say, oh, I just want one more football scholarship this year. I got this kid. I think he's really good. I want to stash him. If you go over by one scholarship in any sport, you automatically, is my understanding, trigger the 2.5 million. So you have to have a plan for all of it. What the NCAA and the conferences feared was that if they allow such substantial extra scholarship spending, then what would stop schools from stashing players? So, and this is a very rudimentary history lesson. I'm sure there was more to it than this. But this was the way it was always told to me, anyway, growing up in Atlanta with a Georgia Tech alumnus grandfather. That Georgia Tech left the SEC essentially because Bear Bryant got into the practice of signing like twice as many kids every year as he knew he needed. But there were rules, as there were for so many different conferences, around transferring in conference. So what he'd do is he'd sign a whole bunch more than he needed, cut a bunch of them, and then those players wouldn't be able to transfer to another SEC school. And Bobby Dodd, who was Georgia Tech's legendary head coach, won, I think, 3 national titles there in the 50s, basically went to the SEC office and said, we have to stop this. This isn't fair. The SEC office wouldn't stand up to Bear Bryant, and so Bobby Dodd picked Georgia Tech up and took him out of the SEC and went independent. What I think there was, again, I'm sure there's more to it than that. That was the story. It was as it was always relayed to me. What I think the powers that be all feared was that in a more modern construct. So if you added 25 scholarships in football, what would stop, a school that did that from going out and using, its NIL plus its revenue sharing money independent of the extra scholarships to take a bunch of players and just stash them on its roster? And then, you'd have even more centralization of talent. The rich would only get richer. It would be harder for, the talent to disperse, and the sport would become even more homogenized. So they came up with this idea of roster caps. And they said that, your scholarship limits remain the same. We're going to cap the total number of players, scholarship and non-scholarship, you can have on your roster at any given time. And you can add scholarships up to that cap, but you can't go past it. You can't go past it for scholarship players. You can't go past it for walk-ons, not for anybody. What I think justifiably some some complainants in the House case have argued is if we institute these roster caps effective July 1, a bunch of athletes are going to get cut loose. And we're talking in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. If you want to add up, football is the example everyone uses because football's roster cap is going to be 105. Most football programs tend to have 125 to 130 players. There are a handful that have even more than that. Obviously, it's 85 plus walk-ons. What people have argued is, and what Claudia Wilkin, the judge presiding over the House case, seems to be endorsing, is the idea of grandfathering these in and stepping them down so you can let the vast majority of these players just sort of graduate off your rosters and then just not replace them. For the moment, the NCAA and the conferences seem to be holding firm against this. I think there's been maybe some suggestions of movement this week. I don't think anybody really understands why something this seismic and important, why this would be the hill to die on, to sort of kill the House settlement on. Because listen, I mean, the party that's probably most motivated in the end by the House settlement is the NCAA, because if this goes to trial, recent precedent suggests the NCAA will lose, and that the financial penalty could be much, much larger. I don't know if it's a class action. This is where I start to swim into deep water, legally, in terms of legalese. But I mean, it could just bankrupt the whole system and force us to start over. And I'm not totally sure that there wouldn't be some positive elements. I'm not necessarily bankrupting the system, but more kind of what we have here in general. And this is where I will get a little conceptual. It's like if you've got a car that is breaking down and you don't really want to pay the $2,000 to fix it. So you pay like a $200 repair and then a $300 repair and then another $200 repair. And you just keep throwing good money after bad into it, knowing in the end, you're still going to have this, sort of this Band-Aid you got to rip off anyway. That's kind of where I think we are with college athletics. And this goes beyond just the House case, but to talk about collective bargaining, multi-year contracts, how to reform the transfer windows, how to create a wealth redistribution system that doesn't allow the rich to get richer without any sort of compensation going back the other way to schools further down the financial ecosystem or further down the financial pyramid. This is my moderately informed opinion, is that the argument over roster caps and the extent to which, at least for the moment, the NCAA and the member conferences, the defendants in the House case, have decided to kind of dig their heels in and push back, is just kind of representative of that wider idea that all politics are short term and nobody wants to do the hard thing that might make everyone's life more difficult immediately, but make all of this work better in the 5-year plan, in the 10-year plan, in the 20-year plan. And maybe some of the people that take these tough decisions have to wear them, and maybe they wind up, ultimately pushed to one side because of the criticisms and things that come with it. But it winds up working out better for the whole system long term. I think that this is just kind of like the latest example of leaders just not being willing to sort of absorb a little more short-term pain for more long-term gain. Now, what I'm talking about in the wider conceptual sense is a pretty dramatic renovation of college athletics and its power structure, its financial structure, all that stuff. But I think we're going to keep getting pushed in that direction. And the House settlement is a really important, almost like pressure release valve that allows everyone to keep moving forward without the whole thing just collapsing on itself. And I don't really this is just me speaking personally, I don't really understand why there hasn't been more of an appetite to compromise over something, excuse me, something as seemingly, I don't want to say benign, but certainly manageable as gradually introducing a roster cap so we don't wind up in a situation where there are thousands of athletes starting July 1 who are simply told, you're not on my team. You don't have a place on the team anymore. Sorry. That was probably more than you were looking for, but it's like the here, like what is specific to the here and now, at least in my estimation or my processing of all this, is symptomatic of a larger problem, which is that we can all generally see where this is going. And even more than that, we can probably all recognize most of the benefits that we get by tearing off that Band-Aid and by, just sort of, what's the old Irish phrase, throwing our cap over the walls so that we have no choice but to climb it. But we, in the here and now, as we're still dealing with, basically just constant short-term gain with short-term pain attached to it, the House case does seem to be resting on whether or not someone will give on this question of roster caps. And if it doesn't, I mean, we could be talking about an even more seismic event in, the history and the structure of college athletics, which is why I think eventually there will be a compromise, why I think eventually, everyone will metaphorically speaking, put their guns down. But it hasn't happened yet. And there's going to be a lot of sort of worried fascination around here. And by here, I mean just all of college athletics until it's resolved.
For sure. Good stuff. Excellent stuff as always, Zach. Thanks for braving your illness to make time for us on Podcast on the Brink. Always great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Sorry about my nasally voice.
It's all good. Thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star rating over on Spotify. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.